Geneva, Switzerland, March 14, 1991, 8:17 p.m. A man sits alone at a corner table in Le Richemont, one of Geneva's most expensive restaurants, the kind of place where diplomats conduct quiet conversations and international deals get made over wine that costs more than most people earn in a week. The man is in his late 30s, dressed in a well-tailored but unremarkable dark suit. His hair is carefully styled. His watch is Swiss but not ostentatious. Everything about him suggests successful professional, someone who belongs in this environment without drawing particular attention. On the white tablecloth in front of him, partially concealed by a leather portfolio, are 3 passports. One is Canadian, dark blue with the gold maple leaf. One is French, burgundy red with the European Union stars. One is Turkish, deep crimson with the national emblem. Each passport contains his photograph. Each shows a different name. Each represents a completely different identity he will inhabit over the next 4 hours. The restaurant is busy but not crowded. Businessmen discuss contracts. A couple celebrates an anniversary. Waiters move with practiced efficiency. Nobody notices the man with 3 passports because he has made himself invisible through the simple act of appearing exactly like everyone else in the room. Wealthy, comfortable, unremarkable. What nobody in this restaurant knows, what they have no reason to suspect, is that this man is a Mossad operative, that his real name is Eli Cohen, no relation to the famous Israeli spy of the same name, and that over the next few hours he will conduct 3 separate intelligence meetings with 3 different targets, each of whom believes they are meeting someone completely different. He will speak 3 different languages with 3 different accents. He will inhabit 3 different personalities with 3 different backstories. He will be Canadian, then French, then Egyptian. And he will do all of this in the same hotel complex with the same waiter potentially serving him multiple times, with the constant risk that one of his targets will see him with another and realize something is wrong. This is the story of how one man fluent in 11 languages spent a single evening convincing 3 intelligence targets that he was 3 completely different people. How he extracted critical intelligence about Iraqi weapons programs, NATO classified documents, and Hezbollah funding networks all in one night. How he maintained perfect linguistic and cultural authenticity across 3 separate identities. And how one tiny mistake, a single Arabic phrase used in the wrong regional dialect, almost destroyed not just the operation, but exposed one of Mossad's most valuable assets and potentially cost him his life. And here is what makes this absolutely insane. The 3 people Eli was meeting that night were all staying in the same hotel. They were all professional intelligence, operatives or connected to intelligence networks. They were all paranoid, trained to detect deception, and hyper-aware of potential Israeli operations. One of them was actively looking for Israeli agents, and Eli convinced all 3 that he was exactly who he claimed to be, at least until the moment when his perfect cover cracked in the most dangerous way possible. The operation required more than just language skills. It required psychological transformation. It required Eli to not just speak like different people, but think like them, to inhabit their cultural frameworks so completely that every gesture, every reference, every unconscious mannerism matched the identity he was projecting. Most people think being a spy means having good lies and fake documents, but at the level Eli operated, it meant becoming someone else so thoroughly that you temporarily forget who you actually are. The best cover is not a performance. It is a complete psychological inhabitation of another identity. And the cost of that kind of transformation, the toll it takes on a person's sense of self, is something intelligence agencies rarely discuss, but every deep cover operative knows intimately. You become the cover. And sometimes you cannot find your way back to whoever you were before. Eli checks his watch, 8:22 p.m. His first meeting is in 8 minutes. The target will arrive punctually because that is his character. Eli reaches under the portfolio and slides the Canadian passport closer while pushing the other two deeper under the leather folder. He takes a slow breath, a centering technique his Mossad trainers taught him years ago. Then he performs the internal shift, the psychological recalibration that transforms him from Eli Cohen, Israeli intelligence officer, into Michael Rousseau, Canadian mining equipment executive from Montreal. The accent comes first, settling into his mind like changing the language setting on a computer. Then the mannerisms, the slightly more open body language Canadians use, the self-deprecating humor, the political neutrality. Then the memories, the fabricated but meticulously detailed backstory that he has studied so thoroughly it feels real. The apartment in Montreal he has never seen but can describe room by room. The university he attended, the professors he studied under, all real people who have no idea their names are being used. The mining company he works for, an actual business that Mossad has carefully infiltrated to the point where, if anyone calls to verify his employment, the receptionist will confirm he works there and has been with the company for 6 years. By the time the Turkish arms dealer walks through the restaurant entrance at exactly 8:30 p.m., Eli is no longer Eli. He is Michael, and Michael has been waiting to discuss mining equipment contracts with a potential client from Ankara. Everything appears completely normal. A business meeting in Geneva, a Canadian executive, and a Turkish businessman. Nothing that would interest anyone, nothing suspicious at all. Except that over the next 90 minutes, Michael Rousseau will extract intelligence about Iraqi missile component purchases that will help Israel understand Saddam Hussein's weapons programs. And he will do it while discussing drill bits and excavation equipment. That is the art of it. The intelligence operation hidden inside a completely legitimate interaction, conducted by someone who has made himself invisible by becoming exactly who he claims to be. To understand how Eli Cohen ended up in that Geneva restaurant with 3 passports, you have to go back to 1987, when Mossad realized it had a problem that traditional espionage techniques could not solve. Middle Eastern intelligence services, particularly those in Syria, Iraq, and Libya, had become extraordinarily sophisticated at detecting Israeli operatives. They were not just looking for fake documents or suspicious behavior anymore. They had started using linguistic forensics, essentially using language experts to analyze how people spoke to detect Hebrew speakers pretending to be Arab or European. The human voice, it turns out, is almost impossible to completely disguise. When you learn a language as an adult, you carry acoustic patterns from your native language into the new one. The rhythm of your sentences, the way you pronounce certain consonants, even the breathing patterns between words, all contain markers of your linguistic origin. Israeli operatives who learned Arabic as adults, no matter how fluent they became, retained subtle Hebrew acoustic signatures that trained analysts could detect. Mossad had lost 3 operations in 18 months because targets identified operatives as Israeli based solely on linguistic analysis of recorded conversations. The problem was particularly acute because many of Israel's most important intelligence targets were Arabic-speaking. Syrian military officers, Iraqi weapons dealers, Palestinian militant leaders, Hezbollah financiers. All conducted business in Arabic, all were increasingly paranoid about Israeli infiltration, and all had access to linguistic experts who could analyze voice recordings and identify non-native speakers with disturbing accuracy. Traditional solutions were not working. Recruiting Arab citizens of Israel helped, but those operatives faced their own complications. Their Israeli accents in Hebrew sometimes bled into their Arabic. Their cultural knowledge was often incomplete because they had grown up in Israeli society rather than Arab countries. And most critically, hostile intelligence services had started assuming that any Arabic speaker who seemed too willing to help foreign interests might be Israeli Arab, which created its own form of suspicion. Mossad needed something different. They needed operatives who did not just speak Arabic fluently, but who had grown up speaking it, who had internalized its rhythms and patterns from childhood, who could think in Arabic rather than translating from Hebrew, and they needed these operatives to be able to do the same thing with multiple other languages. The concept that emerged was called Operation Chameleon, though that name was not used officially and appears in declassified documents only as a project designation number. The idea was to recruit individuals who had grown up multilingual, who had learned 3 or more languages before age 10, whose brains had developed the neurological flexibility that comes from childhood language acquisition. These individuals, linguistic research suggested, could learn additional languages as adults with near-native fluency because their brains had been wired for multilingual processing during critical developmental periods. More importantly, they could code switch, the technical term for shifting between languages and the cultural frameworks associated with them, with a fluidity that adult language learners could rarely achieve. They could not just speak like different people, they could think like different people, inhabit different cultural identities, and perform the kind of deep psychological transformation that intelligence operations increasingly required. Finding candidates for Operation Chameleon was difficult because the requirements were extremely specific. The person needed to be Jewish, or at least committed to Israel enough to work for Israeli intelligence, a complicated requirement given that many multilingual people who grew up in Middle Eastern countries had complex relationships with Israeli identity. They needed to have grown up speaking at least 3 languages natively, which meant they probably came from mixed cultural backgrounds or had lived in multiple countries during childhood. They needed to have the psychological stability to handle deep cover operations, which eliminated a significant percentage of candidates because the kind of childhood that produces extreme multilingualism is often unstable or traumatic. And they needed to be willing to essentially erase their own identity for years at a time, to become someone else so completely that friends and family would not recognize the person they had become. Out of approximately 200 initial candidates identified across Israeli universities, immigrant communities, and international recruitment efforts, only 11 made it through initial screening. Of those 11, only 3 completed the full training program. And of those 3, only Eli Cohen demonstrated the psychological resilience and operational capability to be deployed on the kind of mission that required inhabiting multiple identities in rapid succession. Eli was born in Casablanca, Morocco in 1952, which made him 39 years old at the time of the Geneva operation. His father was a Moroccan Jew who spoke Arabic and Berber. His mother was French, from a family that had lived in Morocco for 3 generations but maintained French cultural identity. Eli grew up speaking Arabic with his father, French with his mother, and Hebrew at Jewish school. By age 7, he was fluent in all 3 languages with native proficiency in each, his brain having developed during the critical language acquisition period with all 3 languages present simultaneously. His family immigrated to Israel in 1963 when Eli was 11, part of the wave of Moroccan Jewish immigration following Moroccan independence and increasing political instability. In Israel, Eli added Hebrew to his linguistic repertoire, though he already spoke it functionally from religious education. He was bullied in school for his accent, for being Moroccan. For the Arabic, he spoke at home. Israeli society in the 1960s was not kind to Mizrahi Jews, Jews from Arab countries. They were seen as less educated, less European, less modern than the Ashkenazi Jews who dominated Israeli institutions. Eli learned to code switch as a survival mechanism, speaking Hebrew without Arabic influence at school, speaking French when he wanted to seem sophisticated, speaking Arabic only at home where it was safe. This childhood experience of navigating multiple linguistic and cultural identities while hiding his authentic self from hostile scrutiny turned out to be perfect preparation for intelligence work, though Eli did not realize this until much later. He studied linguistics at Tel Aviv University, completing a doctorate focused on multilingual cognitive processing. He became a professor, published research papers, lived a quiet academic life teaching students about phonetics and language acquisition. He had no military service, having been exempted due to vision problems, and no apparent connection to intelligence work, which made him perfect for recruitment. In 1986, a colleague at the university mentioned Eli's unique linguistic background to someone who mentioned it to someone else, and eventually the information reached a Mossad recruiter looking for candidates for Operation Chameleon. The approach was subtle, disguised as academic interest in his research. Would he be interested in consulting on a language training program? The pay would be good. The work would be interesting. Nothing dangerous, just helping develop better language education methods. Eli agreed because the money was useful and the work sounded intellectually engaging. He had no idea he was being evaluated for intelligence recruitment until 6 months later, when the actual offer came. The training program that transformed Eli Cohen from a linguistics professor into one of Mossad's most capable field operatives took 3 years, from 1987 to 1990. This was not normal Mossad training, which typically lasted 6 to 12 months for field agents. Operation Chameleon required something different, something deeper. They were not just teaching Eli how to use dead drops and surveillance detection. They were teaching him how to become someone else so completely that he would forget, at least temporarily, who he actually was. The training began with language expansion. Eli already spoke Arabic, Hebrew, French, and Berber with native fluency. Mossad added English, German, Spanish, Turkish, Farsi, and Italian. Not just functional language learning, but the kind of deep cultural linguistic acquisition that included regional dialects, slang, cultural references, and the unconscious mannerisms that native speakers use without thinking about them. For English, Eli learned both American and Canadian accents because Canadian identity was useful for international operations. Canadians were seen as harmless, politically neutral, and similar enough to Americans to operate in similar spaces without the anti-American hostility that often complicated U.S. intelligence operations. Each language came with cultural immersion that bordered on psychological programming. When Eli was learning to operate as a French identity, he spent 6 months living in France, not as himself, but as the person he would become. He rented an apartment in Paris under a false identity. He worked a cover job. He developed a complete life with friends, routines, favorite cafes, regular habits. He went to the same bakery every morning. He had coffee at the same cafe every afternoon. He dated a woman who had no idea he was not actually French. This was not just about learning French culture. It was about creating authentic memories and experiences that would make his French identity real. When Eli later operated as a French person, he would not be pretending. He would be accessing an identity he had actually lived, complete with genuine memories and emotional experiences that no amount of studying or practice could replicate. The woman he dated eventually broke up with him because she said he seemed emotionally distant, like he was performing rather than being present. She was more right than she could have known. The same process repeated for each major identity Mossad developed for Eli. He spent time in Canada building the Michael Rousseau identity. He spent time in Egypt building the Tariq al-Masri identity. He spent time in Turkey building other cover identities that would be used in future operations. Each time, he lived the identity completely. Each time, he created real memories and real emotional experiences. Each time, he had to eventually extract himself from the life he had built and return to being Eli Cohen, though each time that return became more difficult. The psychological impact of this training was significant and not entirely anticipated by Mossad's planners. Living multiple identities sequentially, spending months or years as someone else, creates a form of dissociation where your sense of stable identity begins to fragment. Eli started experiencing something his trainers called identity bleed, where characteristics of one identity would unconsciously appear while he was inhabiting another. He would speak French with an Arabic accent or use Turkish idioms while speaking English. More concerning, he started having difficulty accessing his authentic self. The original Eli Cohen, who had existed before all these fabricated identities, were layered on top. Mossad brought in psychological specialists to help Eli manage this identity fragmentation. They taught him compartmentalization techniques, mental exercises that allowed him to maintain boundaries between different identities. They taught him grounding practices, ways to reconnect with his core sense of self when the identity started to blur. They monitored him carefully for signs of psychological breakdown because they knew that what they were doing to Eli, this deliberate fragmentation of identity, was potentially traumatic in ways that traditional intelligence training was not. You can teach someone to shoot a gun, to conduct surveillance, to use encryption. Those are skills that you learn and employ. What Mossad was doing with Eli was different. They were teaching him to temporarily stop being himself and become someone else. And the line between temporary and permanent is not as clear as it seems, especially when you cross it repeatedly over several years. By 1990, Eli had completed the training program and was ready for operational deployment. His first mission was relatively simple, a test of his capabilities. He traveled to Beirut as Philippe Marchand, a French cultural affairs officer, and successfully collected intelligence on Palestinian militant groups operating from refugee camps in southern Lebanon. The operation lasted 3 weeks. Eli never broke character. His French identity was so convincing that Lebanese intelligence officers who routinely monitored foreign nationals never flagged him as suspicious. He attended cultural events, met with Lebanese government officials, and conducted what appeared to be completely legitimate diplomatic work while gathering information about Hezbollah's organizational structure and Iranian funding mechanisms. The operation was considered a significant success. Eli had demonstrated that he could operate in hostile territory, maintain complex cover identities under sustained scrutiny, and extract valuable intelligence that other methods could not obtain. Mossad began planning more ambitious operations. Over the next year, Eli conducted 7 more operations, each one slightly more complex and dangerous than the last. He operated in Syria as a Turkish businessman. He operated in Iraq as a German engineer. He operated in Jordan as an Egyptian journalist. Each operation was successful. Each operation demonstrated that Mossad's investment in Operation Chameleon was paying off. Eli was providing intelligence that traditional espionage methods could not access because his linguistic and cultural authenticity allowed him to penetrate environments where other Israeli operatives would be immediately identified. But each operation also took its toll. The constant identity shifting, the psychological stress of maintaining perfect cover, the isolation of never being able to be yourself, all of it accumulated. Eli's psychological evaluations started showing signs of strain. His trainers noticed that he was having more difficulty returning to his baseline identity after operations. He would continue speaking in accent or using mannerisms from his cover identity days after an operation ended. He started forgetting details about his actual life, his real childhood in Morocco, his real family. The fabricated memories from his cover identities were becoming more vivid than his authentic memories. Mossad's psychological team recommended reducing Eli's operational tempo, giving him longer breaks between missions to recover and reintegrate. But in early 1991, an operational opportunity emerged that was too valuable to delay. Intelligence indicated that 3 high-value targets would all be in Geneva at the same time: a Turkish arms dealer with information about Iraqi weapons programs, a French intelligence officer selling NATO classified documents, a Syrian diplomat involved in Hezbollah funding. Each target represented a critical intelligence gap. Each could be approached and recruited or exploited using carefully crafted cover identities. And Eli was the only Mossad operative who could credibly inhabit all 3 identities required to approach all 3 targets. The operational planning began in February 1991. The operation would take place over a single evening in March. Eli would conduct 3 separate intelligence meetings, each using a different identity, each extracting different information. The risk was enormous. If any of the targets saw Eli with another target, the entire operation would be compromised. If Eli made any linguistic or cultural mistake, years of carefully built cover could be destroyed. And if anything went wrong, Eli would be trapped in Switzerland with 3 different identities, none of them his real one, trying to extract himself from a hostile situation with multiple intelligence services potentially hunting him. Eli agreed to the operation despite his psychological team's concerns. He said he could handle it. He said the identities were strong enough. He said he knew how to maintain the boundaries and manage the stress. He was confident, maybe too confident, in his ability to be 3 different people in one night without losing track of which one was real. The operation was scheduled for March 14, 1991. Eli would fly to Geneva as himself and check into a hotel under his Canadian identity. The targets would arrive over the following days. The meetings would happen in sequence, spaced 3 hours apart, to give Eli time to physically and psychologically transform between identities. Everything was carefully planned. Everything was meticulously prepared. Every contingency had been considered, except for the one thing that nobody predicted, that Eli, under the stress of inhabiting 3 separate identities in rapid succession, would make a linguistic mistake so small that most people would never notice it, but so significant that it would nearly destroy everything. Geneva in March 1991 was a city conducting the quiet business of international power. The Cold War had officially ended. The Soviet Union was collapsing. But the intelligence wars continued, perhaps even more intensely, because the old certainties were gone and everyone was scrambling to understand what would come next. Switzerland, perpetually neutral, perpetually discreet, was where people came when they wanted to have conversations that could not happen in their home countries, where intelligence officers from hostile nations could meet under the fiction of diplomatic protocols, where arms dealers could negotiate with government representatives without the scrutiny that would occur in more visible locations, where secrets were bought and sold in restaurants and hotel lounges, while the Swiss banking system ensured that financial transactions remained untraceable. Mossad had identified 3 individuals who would all be in Geneva during the same week, all staying in the same hotel complex, all engaged in activities that Israeli intelligence desperately wanted to monitor and potentially disrupt. The first target was Mehmet Yilmaz, a Turkish arms dealer who specialized in facilitating weapons transfers between European manufacturers and Middle Eastern buyers. That sounds innocuous, like legitimate international trade, but Mehmet's clients included Iraqi military procurement officers who were rebuilding Iraq's weapon systems after the Iran-Iraq War. Israel knew that Saddam Hussein was actively pursuing ballistic missile technology and potentially nuclear weapons capabilities. Understanding what Iraq was buying, from whom, and how they were bypassing international sanctions was critical for Israeli strategic planning. Mehmet was careful. He used legitimate business covers. He worked through shell companies and third-party intermediaries. He never personally touched weapons, only paperwork and money. He was also paranoid about Israeli intelligence because he knew that Israel monitored arms sales to hostile countries aggressively. He had been approached by someone he suspected was Mossad in 1989 and had terminated all contact immediately. Since then, he was extremely cautious about new business relationships. Any approach would need to be through a completely credible business cover with legitimate commercial reasons for contact. The second target was Jean-Claude Beaumont, a mid-level officer in France's DGSE, their external intelligence service, who had financial problems and was selling classified NATO documents to supplement his income. This was exactly the kind of insider threat that intelligence services fear most. Beaumont had access to NATO military planning documents, including information about NATO's strategic posture regarding Middle Eastern conflicts. he had access to intelligence sharing agreements between NATO members. He had access to assessments of Israeli military capabilities that NATO members had compiled. All of this information would be valuable to Israel, not because Israel wanted to harm NATO, but because understanding how NATO members assessed Israeli capabilities would help Israel understand how those countries would react to future Israeli military operations. Beaumont was selling documents to a Russian contact, but Mossad believed he could be convinced to sell to other buyers if the price was right. The challenge was approaching him in a way that would not trigger his defensive protocols. He was trained in counterintelligence. He would be suspicious of anyone who seemed too eager or too well-informed. The third target was Dr. Rashid al-Hamidi, a Syrian diplomat officially assigned to a Syrian economic mission in Geneva, but actually a senior intelligence officer managing Hezbollah's financial networks in Europe. Syria was a primary sponsor of Hezbollah, the Lebanese militant group that conducted operations against Israeli military and civilian targets. Understanding how money flowed from Syria to Hezbollah, which European banks were being used, which individuals were serving as financial intermediaries, would allow Israel to potentially disrupt Hezbollah's funding and prevent future attacks. Dr. al-Hamidi was sophisticated, educated at the Sorbonne, fluent in French and English in addition to Arabic. He moved comfortably in European diplomatic circles. He maintained the fiction that he was an economic development specialist while actually coordinating with Hezbollah operatives across Europe. He was also intensely suspicious of Israeli intelligence operations and had received training in how to detect Israeli agents. He knew that Israel used Arabic-speaking operatives. He knew about linguistic forensics. He had personally identified 2 suspected Israeli agents in previous years based on subtle linguistic markers. Approaching him successfully would require not just perfect Arabic, but specifically Egyptian Arabic. Because the cover identity Mossad had developed for Eli was Egyptian, and any deviation from authentic Egyptian dialect would immediately trigger al-Hamidi's suspicions. The operational challenge was not just that these 3 targets were difficult to approach individually. The challenge was that they were all staying in the same hotel complex and all conducting business in the same areas of Geneva. The hotel was the Beau Rivage, an upscale property near Lake Geneva that was popular with international business travelers and diplomatic missions. The hotel had 3 restaurants, 2 bars, and multiple lounges where informal meetings occurred constantly. The risk of one target seeing Eli with another target was significant. If Mehmet saw Eli meeting with Dr. al-Hamidi, he might wonder why a Canadian mining executive was having intense conversations with a Syrian diplomat. If Jean-Claude saw Eli meeting with Mehmet, he might become suspicious about why the same person who approached him about NATO documents was also meeting with a Turkish arms dealer. Any overlap would create questions that could compromise the entire operation and potentially expose Eli as an intelligence operative. Mossad's operational planning team spent weeks working through contingencies. They mapped out the hotel layout. They identified which restaurants and meeting spaces would minimize the risk of targets encountering each other. They scheduled the meetings 3 hours apart, enough time for Eli to physically transform between identities and for previous targets to have left the hotel complex. They identified exit routes Eli could use if he needed to abort a meeting quickly. They positioned support personnel in Geneva, though at a distance because Switzerland's intelligence service was sophisticated and would notice any obvious Israeli presence. They created communication protocols that would allow Eli to signal if something went wrong. They prepared emergency extraction procedures in case the entire operation collapsed and Eli needed to get out of Switzerland immediately. Every detail was planned, every contingency considered. On paper, the operation was sound. But intelligence operations are not conducted on paper. They are conducted by human beings under stress, making split-second decisions in situations where perfect planning meets imperfect reality. And sometimes, under that kind of pressure, even the most carefully trained operative makes mistakes. Michael Rousseau arrived at the hotel bar at 8:28 p.m., 2 minutes before his scheduled meeting with Mehmet Yilmaz. He had chosen the bar deliberately, a space that was public enough to seem casual but quiet enough for substantive conversation. The bar was dark wood and leather, the kind of masculine space where business deals happened over whiskey. Michael ordered a Canadian club on the rocks, a small detail that reinforced his identity. Canadians abroad often ordered Canadian whiskey when available, a subtle form of patriotic preference that seemed authentic precisely because it was so minor. When Mehmet walked in at exactly 8:30, scanning the room with the careful attention of someone who always assessed his environment, Michael raised his hand in a friendly wave. Not too enthusiastic, just the measured greeting of a businessman who had arranged a meeting with a potential client. Mehmet approached, shook hands, and sat down. His handshake was firm, but not aggressive. His expression was neutral, professional. He ordered Turkish coffee, which took several minutes to prepare, which gave them time for preliminary conversation. Michael spoke first, his accent carrying the distinctive French-inflected English of Montreal. He explained that his company, Rousseau Mining Equipment, was looking to expand into Middle Eastern markets. They manufactured specialized drilling equipment for mineral extraction, particularly equipment designed for difficult geological conditions. He understood that Mehmet had connections throughout the region and might be able to facilitate introductions to potential clients in Turkey, Iraq, and the Gulf states. The cover story was perfect because it was built on real infrastructure. Rousseau Mining Equipment actually existed. It was a legitimate Canadian company that Mossad had carefully infiltrated over several years, placing assets in key positions until they effectively controlled it without owning it officially. If Mehmet investigated the company, which he certainly would, he would find a functioning business with real clients, real projects, and real financial records. He would find that Michael Rousseau was listed as their international sales director. He would find nothing suspicious because there was nothing suspicious to find, except that the entire operation existed to provide cover for Israeli intelligence operations. Mehmet was cautious, asking detailed questions about the equipment specifications, the manufacturing process, the company's previous international contracts. Michael answered with technical precision, demonstrating genuine knowledge of mining equipment because he had spent 3 months learning the industry as part of his cover development. He discussed drill bit metallurgy, rotary percussion systems, and geological survey methodologies with the fluency of someone who actually worked in the field. This was critical because sophisticated targets like Mehmet could detect superficial cover stories. If Michael had only surface knowledge, if he stumbled on technical questions, Mehmet would immediately become suspicious. But Michael's knowledge was deep and authentic, built through the same immersive process that made his language skills convincing. He was not pretending to be a mining equipment executive. For the purposes of this conversation, he was one. The discussion gradually shifted from equipment specifications to market opportunities. Michael mentioned that he understood Iraq was investing heavily in infrastructure development, including mining operations in the northern regions. He had heard that despite international sanctions, Iraq was still purchasing industrial equipment through various channels. He wondered if Mehmet might know people who could facilitate such purchases. This was the delicate moment, the transition from legitimate business discussion to intelligence collection. Michael had to demonstrate interest in doing business with Iraq without seeming too eager, without raising questions about why a Canadian company would want to violate international sanctions. Mehmet's expression remained neutral, but his body language shifted slightly, a subtle tension that suggested Michael had touched on sensitive territory. Mehmet said carefully that Iraq was indeed interested in industrial equipment, but that international sanctions made direct business difficult. There were ways to structure deals through third countries, through companies that could provide necessary paperwork while maintaining discretion. He could potentially facilitate such arrangements for a commission if the equipment and terms were right. Michael nodded, said that he understood the complexity, that his company was willing to work through whatever channels were necessary, as long as the business was profitable and reasonably secure. This was the opening Mossad needed. Over the next 40 minutes, as Mehmet became more comfortable and the whiskey and coffee kept coming, he began discussing the mechanics of sanctions evasion in detail. That was exactly what Israeli intelligence wanted to know. He explained that Iraqi procurement officers were particularly interested in equipment that could be dual use, officially marketed for civilian purposes, but potentially useful for military applications. He mentioned that Iraq was purchasing specialized drilling equipment that was officially for oil exploration, but could potentially be used to construct underground facilities for weapons development or storage. He named specific Iraqi officials who were managing these procurement programs. He described the financial mechanisms being used, how money moved through Turkish and Jordanian banks to European companies to Iraqi end users. He was providing a detailed map of Iraq's sanctions evasion network, and he was doing it because he thought he was talking to a Canadian businessman who might become a lucrative client. Michael listened carefully, asked informed questions, expressed appropriate interest in the business opportunities, while mentally cataloging every name, every detail, every piece of intelligence that Mossad would need. The meeting was going perfectly. Mehmet was relaxed, talkative, and clearly believed that Michael was exactly who he claimed to be. Then came the moment that almost destroyed everything. Mehmet mentioned that he would be in Toronto the following month for other business and suggested they could meet there to continue the discussion, perhaps visit Michael's company headquarters. Michael maintained his expression, smiled, said that would be excellent, that he would be happy to show Mehmet their manufacturing facilities. But internally, his mind was racing. He had prepared for this possibility. Mossad's cover development included detailed knowledge of Toronto, the city where Rousseau mining equipment was supposedly headquartered. Michael had studied maps, memorized street layouts, learned about neighborhoods and landmarks. But he had never actually been to Toronto. His knowledge was entirely theoretical, and now Mehmet was testing him, perhaps deliberately, to see if his cover was real. Mehmet asked casually what neighborhood Michael lived in when he was in Toronto. Michael said the Annex, a neighborhood he had studied that was popular with professionals. Mehmet nodded, said he had visited Toronto several times, asked if Michael knew a specific restaurant on Bloor Street. Michael said yes, though he was inventing the answer based on his knowledge that Bloor Street ran through the Annex and likely had restaurants. The conversation continued for another 15 minutes, but the energy had shifted slightly. Michael was not certain whether Mehmet's questions about Toronto were innocent conversation or deliberate testing. He had answered confidently, but he knew that any small mistake, any reference that did not align with reality, could trigger Mehmet's suspicions. Intelligence operations often succeed or fail on these tiny details: a wrong street name, a restaurant that does not exist, a neighborhood reference that does not make sense to someone who actually knows the city. Michael had survived the test, but barely. As the meeting concluded, they exchanged business cards with contact information. Michael's card was real, with a working phone number that went to a Mossad-controlled answering service that maintained the fiction of Rousseau mining equipment. They agreed to communicate by email to arrange future meetings. They shook hands. Mehmet left the bar first as Michael had planned, ensuring that Mehmet would not see what Michael did next. Michael waited 5 minutes, finished his drink, paid the bill in cash, and left the bar. He had 45 minutes before his next meeting. 45 minutes to transform from Michael Rousseau, Canadian mining executive, into Philippe Marchand, French intelligence officer. 45 minutes to shift languages, accents, mannerisms, and psychological frameworks completely. The first meeting had been successful, but it had also been draining. The constant vigilance, the careful performance, the terror of making a mistake that would expose everything. And he had to do it 2 more times tonight. Eli took the elevator to his room on the 4th floor, room 417, registered under the name Michael Rousseau, with the Canadian passport. The room was standard European hotel luxury, comfortable but impersonal. He had checked in that morning, leaving luggage and personal items that matched his Canadian identity. A laptop with mining industry files, business magazines, clothing appropriate for a sales executive, everything that hotel staff might notice if they entered the room for cleaning or maintenance. But hidden in the bathroom, inside a hollowed-out toiletry case that would pass casual inspection, were the materials for his other identities. Different clothing, different accessories, different documents. Everything he needed to become someone else. He locked the door, put the privacy sign on the handle, and stood in front of the bathroom mirror. For a moment, he let himself just be Eli Cohen. Not Michael, not the identities he would inhabit later tonight, just himself. A 39-year-old man who had spent the last several years becoming other people, who was now so practiced at identity transformation that it felt more natural than being himself. He studied his reflection, looking for the person he used to be before Mossad training fragmented his identity into multiple personas. Sometimes he could barely remember who that person was. The transformation began with clothing. Michael Rousseau wore a dark business suit, conservative tie, polished black shoes. The clothing communicated professional success, North American business culture, someone who worked in a masculine industry like mining equipment. Philippe Marchand needed to project something different. French intelligence officers, even ones selling secrets, maintained a certain style. They were more fashion-conscious than their American or British counterparts, more aware of aesthetics. Eli changed into different trousers, charcoal gray instead of black, cut slightly more fashionably. A different shirt, lighter blue with French cuffs. A different tie, silk, with a more interesting pattern. Different shoes, still professional but more stylish. The clothing shift was not dramatic, but it changed the overall impression from North American businessman to European professional. Someone observing both identities closely might notice these were different people wearing different styles, but casual observation would just register two well-dressed men in a luxury hotel. The physical transformation continued with smaller details. Michael wore a wedding ring because his cover identity was married with 2 children back in Montreal. Philippe did not wear a ring because his cover identity was divorced, a detail that was part of his backstory and explained some of his bitterness about career advancement. Eli removed the ring, placed it carefully in the toiletry case. He changed his watch from a practical Seiko that Michael would wear to a more expensive Longines that Philippe would own. He adjusted his hair slightly, combing it differently, adding a small amount of product to give it more European styling. These details mattered because human observation is subconscious before it is conscious. People notice overall impressions before they notice specific details. The cumulative effect of small changes creates a different person, even if no single change would be dramatic by itself. Eli was constructing Philippe piece by piece, building the visual identity that would support the psychological identity he was about to inhabit. But the real transformation was not physical. It was psychological, linguistic, and neurological. This was the part that Mossad training had focused on most intensely, the internal shift that made deep cover work possible. Eli sat on the edge of the bed, closed his eyes, and began the mental process his trainers called identity anchoring. He started with breathing, slowing it down, creating a meditative state where he could consciously access different parts of his linguistic memory. He thought in French, not translating from Hebrew or English, but actually thinking in French sentence structures with French vocabulary and French cultural frameworks. He accessed memories from his time living in Paris, the 6 months he had spent building the Philippe Marchand identity, the apartment he had lived in on Rue de la Roquette, in the 11th arrondissement, the cafe where he had morning coffee, the owner who knew his name, the woman he had dated, Isabel, who worked in publishing and talked about French literature with passionate intensity. These were real memories, actually experienced, and accessing them made Philippe real rather than fabricated. The accent came next, settling into his vocal patterns like changing frequencies on a radio. French uses different mouth positions than English or Arabic, different tongue placement, different resonance. The rhythm of French sentences is distinct, with emphasis patterns that differ from other languages. Eli spent several minutes speaking out loud in French, reciting poetry he had memorized, having imaginary conversations until his voice sounded completely French even to his own ear. Not French-influenced English, but actual Parisian French with the specific accent and intonation patterns of someone educated in Paris. His voice changed in ways that were subtle but significant. The pitch shifted slightly lower. The resonance became more nasal. The rhythm became more staccato. He was not imitating a French accent. He was speaking French natively, accessing linguistic patterns that were as deeply embedded in his brain as any of his actual native languages. This was what separated Eli from operatives who learned languages as adults. They performed accents. He inhabited them. The psychological framework was the deepest part of the transformation and the most dangerous. Philippe Marchand was not just a name and a backstory. He was a complete personality with distinct characteristics, attitudes, and emotional patterns. Philippe was bitter about his career in DGSE, feeling that he had been overlooked for promotion due to office politics rather than merit. This bitterness was not just a performance detail. Eli had to actually feel it, to access genuine resentment and disappointment that would make Philippe's motivations for selling secrets believable. He thought about his actual disappointments, times in his real life when he had been treated unfairly, and channeled those emotions into Philippe's character. He thought about the stress of his Mossad work, the psychological toll of constant identity shifting, the isolation of never being able to be himself. He took those real feelings and reframed them as Philippe's feelings about his career. The emotional authenticity would make Philippe real in ways that mere acting could not achieve. When Philippe expressed bitterness about being passed over for promotion, it would be genuine emotion, just attributed to fictional circumstances rather than real ones. By the time Eli opened his eyes, Michael Rousseau no longer existed in his consciousness. The Canadian accent was gone. The business executive mannerisms were gone. The psychological framework was completely different. He was Philippe Marchand, sitting in a Geneva hotel room, preparing to meet with a potential buyer for classified documents he had stolen from his employer because he was tired of being undervalued and underpaid. The transformation had taken 35 minutes. He had 10 minutes before he needed to be in the hotel restaurant for his meeting with Jean-Claude Beaumont. He checked his appearance in the mirror one final time, seeing Philippe rather than Eli, seeing a French intelligence officer rather than an Israeli operative. The person in the mirror was real. That was the essential truth of deep cover work. You could not pretend to be someone else and maintain it under sustained scrutiny. You had to actually become someone else, at least temporarily, at least enough to convince yourself before you could convince anyone else. Eli picked up the French passport, the one that identified him as Philippe Marchand, and put it in his jacket pocket. He left the other passports hidden in the room. He walked out the door and took the elevator down to the restaurant, moving with slightly different body language, slightly different posture, slightly different energy. Philippe walked differently than Michael. He held himself with more sophistication, more awareness of aesthetics, more European sensibility. By the time the elevator doors opened on the ground floor, the transformation was complete. The restaurant was busier than the bar had been, filled with hotel guests having late dinner, couples celebrating occasions, business associates concluding deals over wine and conversation. Eli, now completely inhabiting Philippe Marchand, was shown to a table near the back, a location he had requested specifically because it offered privacy while maintaining visibility. Jean-Claude Beaumont would be suspicious of anywhere too isolated, too concealed. Intelligence officers who were selling secrets were paranoid by training and experience. And meeting in a completely private space would trigger defensive protocols. But a table in a busy restaurant surrounded by other diners would seem safer to Jean-Claude, even though it actually gave Eli advantages. The ambient noise provided acoustic cover for their conversation, and the public setting made it less likely Jean-Claude would become aggressive or confrontational if the meeting went badly. Philippe ordered wine, a Bordeaux, because that was what a French intelligence officer would drink, and waited. Jean-Claude arrived 15 minutes late, which Philippe expected. The lateness was a power play, a way to demonstrate control, to assess how Philippe reacted to being kept waiting. Philippe showed no reaction, just smiled when Jean-Claude approached and stood to shake hands with the precise formality that characterized French professional interactions. Jean-Claude was in his late 40s, carefully groomed, wearing an expensive suit that suggested someone who cared about appearance and social status. His expression was guarded, his body language controlled. Everything about him communicated careful professionalism and deep suspicion. They engaged in preliminary conversation in French, the kind of careful verbal sparring that occurred when two intelligence professionals met for the first time. Philippe's French was flawless, perfect Parisian accent with the specific vocabulary and reference points that someone educated at Sciences Po and trained in DGSE would use. He made casual references to internal DGSE politics, mentioned specific individuals by name, demonstrated knowledge that only an insider would possess. This was critical because Jean-Claude would be testing him, looking for any indication that Philippe was not actually who he claimed to be. One wrong reference, one name that did not exist, one detail about DGSE internal structure that was inaccurate, and Jean-Claude would immediately terminate the meeting and disappear. The intelligence community was small enough that false identities claiming insider status were extremely risky. They required perfect knowledge that could only come from extensive research and preparation. The conversation gradually moved from pleasantries to business. Philippe explained that he had access to NATO strategic planning documents, information about military deployments, intelligence sharing protocols between alliance members. He was willing to sell these documents because he was tired of being overlooked for advancement, tired of watching less competent officers receive promotions through political connections while his own career stagnated. The bitterness in his voice was real because Eli was channeling genuine frustration just from different sources than Philippe's fictional career. Jean-Claude listened carefully, asking specific questions about the types of documents available, the classification levels, the intelligence value. Philippe provided detailed answers, demonstrating knowledge of NATO document classification systems, internal routing procedures, the specific departments that produced strategic assessments. All of this information was real, obtained through Israeli intelligence's extensive monitoring of NATO activities. Philippe was not inventing details. He was providing accurate information that made his cover identity credible to someone who could verify these facts. Jean-Claude asked how Philippe had obtained these documents, a critical question because it would reveal whether Philippe had sustainable access or was offering a one-time sale. Philippe explained that his position in DGSE's liaison section gave him regular access to NATO intelligence sharing systems, that he could obtain documents on an ongoing basis as long as he remained employed, that he had already copied several documents to demonstrate the intelligence value before any money changed hands. This was the hook that made the offer compelling. Intelligence buyers wanted ongoing access, not just isolated document purchases. If Philippe could provide regular intelligence from NATO sources, that would be worth significant money and worth the risk of establishing an ongoing relationship. Jean-Claude asked about Philippe's security protocols, how he was copying documents without detection, how he planned to transfer them without leaving traces. Philippe described methods that were technically sophisticated based on actual insider threat techniques that intelligence services worried about. He mentioned using USB drives disguised as everyday items, photographing documents with miniature cameras, using encrypted communication channels that bypassed organizational monitoring. The methods were believable because they were based on real techniques that insider threats actually used. The meeting continued for 90 minutes, far longer than Eli had anticipated. Jean-Claude was thorough, methodical, deeply suspicious. He tested Philippe repeatedly with detailed questions about DGSE internal procedures, about NATO organizational structure, about specific individuals and offices. Each time, Philippe answered with the confident precision of someone who actually worked in these environments. The preparation Mossad had done was holding up under sustained scrutiny, but Eli could feel the psychological strain of maintaining perfect performance for this length of time. Every answer had to be instantaneous, natural, without the slight pause that would indicate he was searching memory or inventing details. He had to be Philippe so completely that the answers came automatically, drawing on the extensive preparation without conscious effort. This was the exhausting reality of deep cover work. It was not just about knowing information. It was about knowing it so thoroughly that it became instinctive, that you could access it under pressure without breaking character or revealing the cognitive effort of maintaining the deception. Finally, Jean-Claude seemed satisfied. He said that he was interested in establishing an ongoing relationship, that he had buyers. He deliberately did not specify who would pay well for the type of intelligence Philippe was offering. They discussed financial arrangements, communication protocols, document transfer methods. Philippe provided an encrypted email address and a secure file transfer system that were actually controlled by Mossad. They agreed on a trial transaction. Philippe would provide 2 sample documents within 1 week. Jean-Claude would evaluate them, and if the intelligence value matched what was promised, they would proceed with regular exchanges. They shook hands, European style, formal and measured. Jean-Claude left first, as Philippe had planned. Eli remained at the table, finishing his wine, allowing enough time for Jean-Claude to leave the hotel complex before he moved. The meeting had been successful beyond expectations. Not only had Eli established credibility with Jean-Claude, but he had positioned himself to receive actual classified documents that Jean-Claude was stealing from French intelligence. Those documents would be valuable to Israel even if they never completed the financial transaction. But then came the moment that demonstrated how dangerous this kind of operation was, how even perfect planning could not account for random chance. As Eli was signing the check, still inhabiting Philippe Marchand's identity, Mehmet Yilmaz walked past the restaurant entrance. Just walked past, not entering, just visible for a few seconds as he moved through the hotel lobby toward the elevators. Eli, functioning as Philippe, did not react consciously, but Mehmet glanced into the restaurant, his eyes scanning the space the way people do when walking past an open doorway, and his gaze passed over Eli. For just a moment, less than 2 seconds, Mehmet's eyes registered the man sitting at the table near the back of the restaurant. Then he continued walking, disappearing from view. Eli's mind raced through the implications. Had Mehmet actually seen him, or had his glance just passed over without registering? If Mehmet had noticed him, would he recognize him as the Canadian businessman from earlier that evening? Eli looked different now, different clothes, different styling, different body language, but the basic physical features were the same: the face, the build, the general appearance. And Mehmet was trained to be observant, trained to notice details, trained to be suspicious of coincidences. If Mehmet saw the same person twice in the same hotel on the same evening, meeting with different people dressed differently, that would raise questions. Questions that could compromise both meetings and expose Eli as an intelligence operative. Eli forced himself to remain calm, to finish signing the check with Philippe's signature, to stand and leave the restaurant with the measured pace that Philippe would use. He could not rush. He could not show any indication that something was wrong. If hotel staff noticed unusual behavior, if anyone was watching, any sign of panic would be memorable, would create a trace that investigators could follow later if either meeting resulted in security investigations. He walked through the lobby toward the elevators, maintaining Philippe's posture and movement patterns, his mind calculating probabilities and contingencies. If Mehmet had recognized him, what would Mehmet do? Would he investigate immediately, or would he wait to see if the pattern repeated? Would he mention it to someone else, triggering a counterintelligence investigation? Or would he dismiss it as coincidental resemblance, two different people who happened to look similar? Eli reached his room, locked the door, and allowed himself to break character for a moment. The psychological strain of maintaining Felipe for 90 minutes under sustained scrutiny, combined with the sudden threat of potential exposure, had depleted his mental resources. He had one meeting left tonight, one more transformation, one more identity to inhabit, and this one would be the most dangerous of all, because Dr. Rashid al-Hamidi was not just suspicious of potential Israeli agents. He was actively looking for them. Eli had 2 hours before his final meeting, 2 hours to transform from Philippe Marchand into Tariq al-Masri, from a French intelligence officer into an Egyptian businessman, 2 hours to shift from French cultural frameworks into Egyptian Arab cultural frameworks, from European mannerisms into Middle Eastern mannerisms, from one complete psychological identity into another. And he had to do this while processing the potential threat that Mehmet might have recognized him, while managing the accumulated exhaustion of inhabiting multiple identities in rapid succession, while maintaining the psychological discipline required to prevent identity bleed between personas. This was the moment when Mossad's psychological training became critical, when the techniques for compartmentalization and mental discipline were the only things preventing complete psychological fragmentation. Eli sat on the bed, closed his eyes, and performed the grounding exercise his trainers had taught him. He visualized 3 separate rooms in his mind. In one room was Michael Rousseau, the Canadian. In another room was Philippe Marchand, the Frenchman. In a third room was Tariq al-Masri, the Egyptian. Each room had a door that could be closed, sealing off that identity from conscious access. He visualized closing the door to Philippe's room, shutting away that identity and everything associated with it. Then he visualized opening the door to Tariq's room, stepping inside, accessing that identity. The physical transformation began again. Different clothing, appropriate for an Egyptian businessman meeting a Syrian diplomat, more conservative than Philippe's stylish European clothing, but still professional and expensive. Tariq was successful, wealthy, someone who moved in elite Arab business circles. The suit was darker, more traditional in cut. The shirt was white, crisp, expensive cotton. The shoes were Italian leather, because wealthy Arab businessmen often wore Italian shoes as a status marker. Eli removed Philippe's watch and replaced it with a different one, a Rolex Datejust, the kind of watch that communicated wealth without being ostentatious. He added a gold ring, not a wedding band, but a decorative ring that many Arab men wore. He adjusted his appearance in other small ways, using subtle makeup to slightly darken his skin tone, combing his hair differently, adding a touch of cologne that was popular in Middle Eastern business circles. Each detail constructed the visual identity that would support the psychological transformation he was simultaneously performing. The linguistic shift was the most complex part of this transformation because it required not just changing languages, but changing Arabic dialects. Eli spoke Arabic natively, having grown up speaking Moroccan Arabic with his father. But Moroccan Arabic is significantly different from Egyptian Arabic in pronunciation, vocabulary, and grammatical structures. Lebanese Arabic is different from Syrian Arabic. Gulf Arabic is different from all of them. These are not just accents or minor variations. They are substantial linguistic differences that native speakers identify immediately. An Arabic speaker from Morocco claiming to be from Egypt would be identified as fraudulent within minutes of conversation by anyone who actually spoke Egyptian Arabic. Eli had spent months in Egypt building his Tariq al-Masri identity specifically to master Egyptian Arabic to native fluency. He had lived in Cairo, had worked a cover job, had immersed himself completely in Egyptian culture and language until he could think in Egyptian Arabic rather than just speak it. Now he needed to access that linguistic framework while completely suppressing his native Moroccan Arabic patterns. He sat practicing out loud, speaking Egyptian Arabic, reciting conversations, using Egyptian idioms and expressions, until the accent and patterns felt natural and automatic. The cultural framework was equally important. Egyptians and Moroccans shared Arab and Islamic cultural foundations, but they had distinct national characteristics, different historical experiences, different political attitudes. Tariq al-Masri was from Alexandria, from a business family involved in import-export trade, educated at Cairo University, connected to both Egyptian business elites and Palestinian solidarity movements. His political views were carefully calibrated to appeal to someone like Dr. al-Hamidi. He was critical of Israeli policies toward Palestinians, sympathetic to resistance movements, but not so extreme that he would seem like a security risk. He was religious, but not fundamentalist, observant, but not rigid. He was someone who Dr. al-Hamidi would find culturally familiar and politically aligned, someone who could be trusted to discuss sensitive matters. Eli accessed memories from his time in Egypt, real experiences that made Tariq's background authentic. The streets of Alexandria he had walked, the mosque where he had prayed, the cafes where he had spent afternoons. These memories were as real as any other memories in his mind, indistinguishable from his actual childhood memories of Morocco or his adult memories of Israel. That was the psychological complexity that made deep cover work possible and dangerous. The fabricated identities became as real as authentic identity, stored in memory with the same neurological markers that indicated genuine experience. By the time Eli finished the transformation, nearly 90 minutes had passed. He was exhausted, mentally and emotionally depleted from the sustained effort of sequential identity shifts. But he could not afford to show fatigue. Tariq al-Masri would not be tired. He would be energetic, engaging, present. Eli drew on reserves of discipline and commitment, pushing through the exhaustion to maintain operational effectiveness. He checked his appearance one final time, seeing Tariq in the mirror, seeing an Egyptian businessman rather than an Israeli intelligence officer. He picked up the Egyptian passport, the one that identified him as Tariq al-Masri, resident of Alexandria, and put it in his jacket pocket along with business cards from his cover company, an import-export firm that actually existed and would verify his employment if investigated. He left his room and went down to the hotel lounge where he had arranged to meet Dr. al-Hamidi. The lounge was quieter than the bar or restaurant, designed for afternoon tea and evening drinks, furnished with comfortable chairs and low tables that encouraged relaxed conversation. Dr. al-Hamidi was already there when Eli arrived, sitting in a corner chair, reading a newspaper. He looked up as Eli approached, stood with the formal courtesy that characterized Arab professional interactions, and extended his hand. Eli greeted him in Egyptian Arabic, using the appropriate formal expressions, the religious pleasantries that preceded business conversations. Dr. al-Hamidi responded in Syrian Arabic, and they negotiated the linguistic space between dialects with the natural accommodation that occurred when Arabs from different countries conversed. Eli was careful to maintain his Egyptian patterns while understanding Syrian variations, demonstrating the linguistic flexibility that an educated Egyptian businessman would possess. They ordered tea, Egyptian tea prepared the way Egyptians preferred it, strong and sweet, and began the careful preliminary conversation that Arab business culture required before substantive matters could be discussed. Eli talked about his business, import-export between Egypt and Europe, specializing in industrial equipment and consumer goods. Dr. al-Hamidi talked about Syria's economic development efforts, though both of them knew this was fiction covering his actual role, managing Hezbollah finances. The conversation was a delicate dance of shared cultural understanding, political alignment being tested through indirect references and subtle signals. Eli positioned himself as sympathetic to Palestinian causes, critical of Israeli occupation, supportive of resistance movements, but always within the boundaries of what a legitimate Egyptian businessman might express. He was threading a narrow path between demonstrating enough political alignment to be trusted and avoiding extremism that might make him seem like a security risk or agent provocateur. Dr. al-Hamidi was sophisticated and careful, asking questions that tested Eli's knowledge of Egypt, of Alexandria specifically, of business, conditions, of political situations. Each question was a small test, checking whether Tariq's claimed background was real or fabricated. Eli answered with the confidence of genuine experience, drawing on the months he had spent building this identity. He mentioned specific Alexandria neighborhoods, discussed local political figures, referenced Egyptian business practices with the casual familiarity of someone who had lived that reality. The conversation gradually became more comfortable, more trusting, as Dr. al-Hamidi's testing confirmed that Tariq seemed authentic. They discussed regional politics, the Palestinian situation, the role of resistance organizations. Eli carefully positioned himself as someone with business connections that could potentially be useful for moving funds, for facilitating transactions that required discretion, for providing services that formal banking channels could not offer. He was offering exactly what Dr. al-Hamidi needed, someone who could help move money for Hezbollah operations while maintaining the appearance of legitimate business activity. The meeting was succeeding. Dr. al-Hamidi was becoming engaged, interested, beginning to trust that Tariq might be a valuable contact. And then Eli made the mistake that nearly destroyed everything. They were discussing Egyptian business culture, and Eli was explaining how personal relationships were more important than formal contracts in Egyptian business dealings. He said, using what he intended as an Egyptian Arabic expression, that business was built on trust that was makhalef, which in his mind meant deeply rooted or inherited. But makhalef is not an Egyptian Arabic word. It is a Moroccan Arabic word. Egyptians would say taqlidi or mutawarith or several other terms, but not makhalef. The word came from Eli's native Moroccan Arabic, surfacing unconsciously under the stress of maintaining perfect Egyptian Arabic for an extended period, under the accumulated exhaustion of 3 sequential identity performances, under the psychological strain of constantly suppressing his actual linguistic origin. It was a tiny mistake, a single word, but to Dr. al-Hamidi's trained ear, it was immediately and catastrophically wrong. Dr. al-Hamidi's expression changed subtly, his eyes sharpening with sudden attention, his body language shifting from relaxed engagement to guarded assessment. He had caught the error, and Eli knew in that moment that everything he had built over the past hours was collapsing. Dr. al-Hamidi did not react overtly to the linguistic error. He was too sophisticated for that, too experienced in intelligence work to show his suspicions immediately. But Eli saw the change, the subtle shift in his eyes, the slight stiffening of posture, the way his hand moved almost imperceptibly toward his phone on the table. The word makhalef hung in the air between them like a grenade with the pin pulled, waiting to detonate. Eli's mind raced through options, with the desperate speed of someone who understood that the next 60 seconds would determine whether this operation succeeded or whether years of careful cover building would be destroyed along with his own safety. He could not simply ignore the error. That would confirm suspicion. If Tariq were actually Egyptian and had simply misspoken, he would not notice the error because to an Egyptian it would be an incomprehensible word, not a recognizable mistake. But if Eli acknowledged the error, he would be admitting that he was not actually Egyptian, that he was from North Africa, probably Morocco or Algeria, which would immediately raise questions about why someone claiming Egyptian identity would use Maghrebi Arabic. Either response was dangerous, but doing nothing was more dangerous still. Eli made a split-second decision. He laughed, a self-deprecating sound, and said in Egyptian Arabic that he had spent too much time with Moroccan business partners recently and was starting to pick up their expressions. He made it sound like a casual linguistic contamination, the way people who spend time in different regions sometimes temporarily adopt local speech patterns. It was a plausible explanation. Egyptian businessmen who worked with Moroccan companies would be exposed to Moroccan Arabic and might unconsciously use Moroccan words, especially under fatigue or stress. The explanation gave Dr. Al-Hamidi a way to interpret the error as innocent rather than suspicious. But Eli could see that Dr. Al-Hamidi was not satisfied. His expression remained guarded. He asked with careful casualness that indicated the question was anything but casual, which Moroccan companies Tariq worked with. It was a test question, probing whether Eli's explanation would hold up under scrutiny. Eli provided names of actual Moroccan import-export companies, firms that existed and that an Egyptian businessman might realistically partner with. He discussed specific business dealings, citing details that were technically accurate because Mossad's preparation had included extensive research on North African business networks. But he could feel the conversation shifting, the trust that had been building now contaminated by doubt. Dr. Al-Hamidi continued testing him, asking increasingly specific questions about Egyptian business practices, about Alexandria neighborhoods, about political figures, and social connections. Each question was designed to verify whether Tariq's claimed background was genuine or whether the linguistic slip had revealed a deeper deception. Eli answered with sustained precision, drawing on months of preparation and genuine experience living in Egypt. His answers were correct, detailed, authentic. But Dr. Al-Hamidi's suspicion, once triggered, was not easily dispelled. Intelligence officers were trained to trust their instincts, and Dr. Al-Hamidi's instincts were telling him that something was wrong even if he could not identify exactly what. The conversation became a psychological chess game, each question a move, each answer a counter-move, both men understanding that the stakes were far higher than the surface discussion about business partnerships. Eli knew that Dr. Al-Hamidi was evaluating whether to continue the conversation or to terminate it and investigate further. If Dr. Al-Hamidi decided Eli was suspicious, he would make a phone call to Syrian intelligence. They would investigate Tariq al-Masri's background. They would contact Egyptian authorities. They would start pulling threads that would eventually unravel the entire cover identity. The critical moment came when Dr. Al-Hamidi asked about a specific mosque in Alexandria, claiming he had visited it during a trip to Egypt years earlier and wondering if Tariq worshipped there. It was another test question, possibly about a mosque that did not exist or that did exist but that Dr. Al-Hamidi had never visited. Eli had to make an instant decision about how to respond without knowing whether the mosque was real. He chose honesty within the framework of his cover identity. He said he was not familiar with that particular mosque, that Alexandria had hundreds of mosques, and he typically attended one closer to his home in the sporting district. He did not claim knowledge he did not have. He provided an answer that was consistent with what an actual Alexandrian would say, acknowledging the impossibility of knowing every mosque in a city of 5 million people. The response was authentic and therefore convincing. Dr. Al-Hamidi nodded slowly, seeming to accept the answer. But his phone was still on the table, still within easy reach, and Eli could see that he was considering whether to use it. Eli made another calculated decision. He checked his watch, Egyptian gesture, slight movement of the wrist, and said that he unfortunately needed to leave soon for another appointment. He was giving Dr. Al-Hamidi an exit from the conversation that would allow both of them to disengage without forcing a confrontation. If Dr. al-Hamidi wanted to investigate further, he could do so after Eli left. If he wanted to continue building the relationship, they could arrange another meeting. The approach gave Dr. al-Hamidi options, which was psychologically important because intelligence officers who felt cornered became dangerous. Dr. al-Hamidi said that he understood, that he also had other obligations. They exchanged business cards. They agreed to communicate by email to arrange future meetings. But the energy was different from the comfortable engagement that had existed before the linguistic error. There was wariness now, distance, the careful formality of people who were no longer certain they could trust each other. They stood, shook hands with the precise courtesy that Arab business culture required, and Dr. al-Hamidi said in Syrian Arabic that he looked forward to future conversations if circumstances permitted. The conditional phrase was significant. If circumstances permitted, meaning if his investigation of Tariq al-Masri's background confirmed that he was who he claimed to be. Eli walked away from the meeting, knowing that he had approximately 24 hours before Dr. al-Hamidi's investigation would begin producing results that would expose Tariq al-Masri as a fabricated identity. Syrian intelligence was sophisticated. They had contacts in Egyptian security services. They could request background checks, investigate business registrations, contact Egyptian authorities to verify whether Tariq al-Masri was a legitimate businessman or an intelligence operative using false identity. Mossad had built layers of protection into Eli's cover identities, creating paper trails and business records that would withstand initial investigation. But sustained scrutiny would eventually reveal inconsistencies. The import-export company existed, but its ownership was murky. Tariq's residential history in Alexandria was documented, but neighbors who were interviewed would not remember him because he had never actually lived in those locations for extended periods. The cover would not collapse immediately, but it would begin showing cracks that would widen under investigation. Eli needed to extract himself from Geneva immediately before Dr. al-Hamidi's investigation progressed to the point where Syrian intelligence requested Swiss cooperation in detaining a suspected Israeli agent. He returned to his room, moving quickly but not running, maintaining the external calm that operational discipline required, while his mind calculated extraction procedures and contingency protocols. The room looked exactly as he had left it, but Eli's trained awareness noticed a detail that sent ice through his chest. The privacy sign he had left on the door handle was positioned slightly differently, rotated a few degrees from where he had placed it. Someone had been in the room. Hotel housekeeping would have removed the privacy sign entirely if they needed to enter. The sign's repositioned state suggested someone had deliberately disturbed it while trying to return it to its approximate original position. Someone had searched his room while he was at his meeting with Dr. al-Hamidi. Eli's mind ran through the implications. If Dr. al-Hamidi had become suspicious during their conversation, he might have called associates to search Eli's room while he kept Eli occupied in the lounge. Or Mehmet might have recognized Eli as the same person he met earlier, investigated which room he was staying in, and searched it looking for evidence about who Eli really was. Either scenario was catastrophic. If someone had found the hidden materials, the other passports, the surveillance equipment, the intelligence documentation, then Eli's cover was completely blown, and he needed to extract immediately before hostile intelligence services arrived to detain him. Eli checked the room carefully, looking for signs of what the search had discovered. The found, hollowed-out toiletry case where he stored the other passports and materials appeared undisturbed, but someone with professional search training could have opened it and returned it to its approximate original position. He opened the case slowly. The Canadian and French passports were still there, along with the surveillance equipment and communications devices, but the items were arranged slightly differently from how Eli had left them. Someone had found them, examined them, and attempted to replace them to avoid indicating the search had occurred. This was professional work, intelligence service methodology. Whoever had searched the room knew what they were doing and wanted to maintain the fiction that the search had not happened. Eli understood the operational logic. If hostile intelligence suspected he was an Israeli operative but was not certain, they would search his room to gather evidence while allowing him to continue thinking his cover was intact. Then they would either follow him to identify his contacts and support networks, or they would arrange to detain him at a time and place of their choosing, probably at the airport when he attempted to leave Switzerland. Eli had perhaps 2 hours before hostile intelligence made their move. He could not check out of the hotel normally because that would involve going through the lobby where surveillance was certainly positioned. He could not take his luggage because that would indicate he was fleeing. He needed to extract immediately, leaving everything behind, using emergency protocols that would get him out of Switzerland before Dr. Al-Hamidi or Mehmet or whoever had searched his room could coordinate with Swiss authorities to detain him. He took only the essentials, the 3 passports, cash, and a single communications device. Everything else, clothing, documents, equipment, would be left behind. Mossad had anticipated this possibility, had prepared for operations that required immediate extraction with only minutes of warning. Eli activated the emergency extraction protocol using a coded message on his encrypted communication device. The message went to Mossad's operations center in Tel Aviv, triggering immediate response from support teams positioned in Geneva for exactly this contingency. He had 30 minutes to reach an extraction point where a team would meet him and get him out of Switzerland through routes that bypassed normal border controls and airport security. Eli left the room using the service stairs rather than the elevator, avoiding the lobby cameras and potential surveillance in public spaces. He exited through a service entrance that hotel staff used, emerging in an alley behind the hotel complex. The Geneva night was cold, the streets busy with evening traffic and pedestrians. Eli walked quickly, but not frantically, looking like any other hotel guest stepping out for evening air. He moved through several blocks of commercial district using surveillance detection techniques to determine if he was being followed. He saw no obvious surveillance, but professional teams could maintain coverage without being detected by standard counter-surveillance methods. After 6 blocks, he reached the extraction point, a parking garage where Mossad support personnel were waiting with a vehicle. The team leader was someone Eli had worked with on previous operations, someone who knew his real identity and could help him transition from operational crisis back to secure extraction. They drove out of Geneva immediately, heading toward the French border through routes that avoided major checkpoints, using diplomatic credentials that were genuine but belonged to a third country's diplomatic service that Mossad had cultivated relationships with. By midnight, they were across the border into France. By 3 a.m., they were at a safe house near Lyon, where Eli could remain until arrangements were made to get him back to Israel. Eli sat in the safe house living room as dawn light filtered through the curtains, exhausted beyond anything physical fatigue could explain. The extraction had been successful. He was safe, out of immediate danger, protected by Mossad's extensive support infrastructure. But he was also completely depleted, not just from the 18 hours of sustained operational activity, but from the deeper psychological exhaustion of having inhabited 3 complete identities in rapid succession under extreme stress. Michael Rousseau, Philippe Marchand, and Tariq al-Masri had all ceased to exist. The passports were now compromised, the identities burned, the years of careful cover development destroyed in a single evening. Mossad would never use those names or backgrounds again. The Canadian mining company, the French intelligence officer, the Egyptian businessman, all of it was finished. And Eli himself was damaged in ways that were not immediately visible, but that he could feel throughout his consciousness, like cracks spreading through overstressed glass. The person he had been before entering that Geneva hotel, the person who could shift between identities with practiced fluidity, no longer existed. Something fundamental had broken during those hours of sequential transformation, and near exposure. The Mossad debrief began that afternoon, a systematic review of everything that had happened during the operation. Senior officers from Operations Division flew to the safe house to conduct the assessment. They wanted to understand what intelligence had been collected, what had gone wrong, whether the operation's objectives had been achieved despite the emergency extraction. Eli reported methodically, describing each meeting in detail, the intelligence obtained from Mehmet about Iraqi weapons procurement networks, the documents he had positioned himself to receive from Jean-Claude, the information about Hezbollah, finances he had begun extracting from Dr. al-Hamidi. The intelligence was valuable, significant enough to justify the operation's costs and risks. Mehmet's information about Iraqi missile component purchases would help Israel understand Saddam Hussein's weapons programs and potentially disrupt them through diplomatic or covert action. Jean-Claude's willingness to sell NATO documents created an ongoing intelligence source that could be exploited through continued contact. Dr. al-Hamidi's conversation had revealed details about Hezbollah's financial infrastructure that would help Israel target their funding networks. From a pure intelligence assessment perspective, the operation had succeeded. 3 targets had been successfully approached, relationships established, intelligence collected. The emergency extraction was unfortunate but not catastrophic. The identities were burned, but no personnel were captured or killed. In the calculus of intelligence operations, this outcome was acceptable, even successful. But the personal cost to Eli was something the debrief struggled to quantify or even fully acknowledge. The psychological damage from sequential identity inhabitation under extreme stress, from the moment when his perfect Egyptian Arabic had cracked and revealed the Moroccan substrate beneath, from the realization that his room had been searched while he was maintaining perfect performance with Dr. al-Hamidi, from the accumulated weight of years spent being other people until his authentic self had become inaccessible, all of this was harder to measure than intelligence collected or operations completed. Eli tried to explain to the debrief officers that something had broken inside him during that Geneva evening, that the mechanism he used to shift between identities had been damaged by being used too intensely over too short a period. He described the moment when he used the Moroccan word, when his native language had surfaced through the carefully constructed Egyptian identity, and how in that moment he had felt all 3 personas, Michael and Felipe and Tariq, existing simultaneously in his consciousness, competing for dominance, fragmenting his sense of coherent identity. He described the exhaustion that came not from physical activity, but from the sustained effort of being multiple people, the cognitive load of maintaining perfect performance across 3 languages, with 3 accents, with 3 complete cultural frameworks. The debrief officers listened with professional attention, but Eli could see they did not fully understand. How could they? They had never inhabited multiple identities. They had never experienced the psychological vertigo of shifting rapidly between complete personas, the disorientation of accessing fabricated memories that felt as real as authentic experiences, the horror of temporarily forgetting which identity was real and which were operational constructs. The officers discussed his future deployment, suggested that he take a recovery period before returning to operational work, proposed that he might transition to Yados, training new operatives rather than conducting field operations himself. Their suggestions were well-intentioned, but missed the essential reality. Eli was not going to recover from this. The damage was not temporary. Something fundamental in his psychological architecture had been broken by the Geneva operation, and it would not heal with rest or therapy or reassignment to less demanding work. He knew this with absolute certainty even as the debrief officers discussed recovery timelines and future operations. He knew that he would never again be able to inhabit deep cover identities with the fluidity and completeness that had made him valuable to Mossad. The mechanism was broken. The person who could be Michael Rousseau or Philippe Marchand or Tariq al-Masri no longer existed. Eli returned to Israel 2 weeks later, after Mossad confirmed that Swiss authorities were not actively pursuing him and that Dr. al-Hamidi's investigation had not produced enough evidence to trigger international manhunt. The burned identities remained burned, but Eli himself could return to Israel safely. He went through extensive psychological evaluation over several months, sessions with specialists who tried to help him reintegrate the fragmented aspects of his personality to reconnect with his authentic identity beneath the layers of operational personas. The therapy was partially successful. He regained functional stability, could maintain normal social interactions, could live relatively normal life. But he never fully recovered the sense of integrated selfhood he had possessed before Mossad training had deliberately fragmented his identity into multiple operational personas. He continued to experience identity bleed, moments when he would unconsciously slip into French or Arabic accent, when he would use mannerisms from his cover identities, when he would forget temporarily which memories were authentic and which were fabricated as part of operational covers. His relationship with his family became strained because they could not understand what he had experienced during his years in covert operations, and he could not explain it because most of his work remained classified. The official assessment was that Eli Cohen had completed successful career in Israeli intelligence service, that he had conducted multiple high-value operations that provided significant strategic intelligence, that his work had contributed to Israeli national security in ways that could not be publicly acknowledged, but that were deeply appreciated by those who knew the classified details. He received commendations, financial compensation, and the quiet respect accorded to intelligence officers who had served with distinction. But the reality was more complicated. Eli had sacrificed fundamental aspects of his psychological integrity for those operations, had allowed Israeli intelligence to fragment his identity into multiple personas, had paid a personal cost that far exceeded anything the key commendations acknowledged. He left active intelligence work in 1992, taking a position as a consultant on language training programs, teaching new operatives about the techniques he had used while carefully not explaining the psychological price those techniques extracted. He never spoke publicly about his work. The identities he had inhabited, the operations he had conducted, remained classified. Only a few senior Mossad officers knew the complete story of what had happened in Geneva that March evening in 1991. The broader intelligence community learned different lessons from Eli's experience than Eli himself had learned. Intelligence agencies studied the Geneva operation as a case study in multiple identity deployment, analyzing the techniques that had allowed one operative to successfully approach 3 targets in a single evening. They marveled at the operational audacity, the linguistic precision, the psychological sophistication that had made it possible. They incorporated elements of the methodology into their own training programs, teaching operatives how to inhabit multiple identities, how to shift rapidly between personas, how to maintain operational security across sequential meetings with different targets. What they did not adequately address, what most intelligence agencies still do not adequately address, is the psychological cost of this kind of deep cover work. The human price paid by operatives who fragment their identities into multiple personas, who spend years being other people, who lose track of their authentic selves beneath the layers of operational covers. Intelligence services have extensive medical protocols for physical injuries sustained during operations. They have sophisticated security procedures for protecting operational methods and source identities. But they have inadequate support systems for the psychological damage that occurs when you ask someone to temporarily stop being themselves and become someone else, and then ask them to do it repeatedly until they cannot remember who they actually were before the transformations began. Eli lives now, as of this writing, somewhere in Israel under his real name. He is in his early 70s, retired from intelligence work for more than 3 decades. He occasionally gives classified briefings to new intelligence officers, sharing carefully edited accounts of his operational experiences without revealing details that remain sensitive. He speaks multiple languages with perfect fluency, though he is careful about which languages he uses in which contexts. Because the automatic code switching that made him valuable to Mossad also makes it difficult to maintain consistent identity in social interactions. People who know him casually describe him as polite, intelligent, somewhat distant, a person who seems to be present in conversations but also somehow removed, as if part of his consciousness exists in other spaces that observers cannot see. That description is accurate. Part of Eli's consciousness does exist in other spaces, in the identities he inhabited for Israeli intelligence, in the memories he created while living as other people, in the psychological fragments that remain from years of deliberate identity fragmentation. Michael Rousseau and Philippe Marchand and Tariq el-Masri are gone. Their identities burned and abandoned, but they are also still present in Eli's consciousness, ghost personas that occasionally surface in his speech patterns or mannerisms or emotional responses. You become the cover, as he explained to intelligence trainees, and sometimes you cannot find your way back to whoever you were before. The Geneva operation remains classified in most of its details, known to intelligence professionals through rumor and carefully redacted case studies, but not documented in public records. The 3 passports that Eli carried into that hotel restaurant, Canadian and French and Turkish, are presumably destroyed now, stored perhaps in some archive of burned identities and compromised covers. But they represent something larger than operational methodology or intelligence tradecraft. They represent the fundamental question that deep cover operations raise about identity and selfhood, and the price of becoming other people. Can you deliberately fragment your identity into multiple personas without permanently damaging your sense of coherent selfhood? Can you spend years being other people and still remember who you actually are? Can you inhabit fabricated identities with such completeness that they feel real without losing access to your authentic identity beneath the fabrications? The answer, based on Eli's experience and the experiences of other operatives who have conducted similar deep cover work, is probably not. You can do it temporarily. You can do it successfully. But there is a cost, and that cost, measured in psychological fragmentation and identity dissolution and permanent alienation from your authentic self, is something that intelligence services acknowledge privately while rarely discussing publicly. Because the operations require it. Because the intelligence is valuable. Because strategic necessity justifies operational methods that extract extraordinary personal costs from the individuals who execute them. That is the reality of intelligence work at the deepest levels. Not the glamorous fiction of spy novels and action films, but the grinding psychological reality of people who fragment themselves into multiple identities and lose track of which fragments are real.